The heavy oak door was locked from the inside, bolted shut against the violent storm that battered the windows of the isolated estate. When the men finally splintered the wood and broke through, the sight that met them was impossible. Lord Arthur Harrington lay dead on the Persian rug, a silver letter opener buried deep in his chest. There was no secret passage, no open window, and no place for a killer to hide in the empty study. The local police would later call it an unsolvable mystery, a perfect crime executed by a phantom. But the frail, elderly woman sitting quietly in the corner of the drawing room knew better. Jane Marple saw what the police missed entirely. She knew the killer was not a phantom at all, but someone sitting right there in the house, drinking tea and waiting for the storm to pass. To understand how a powerful man could be murdered in an empty, completely sealed room, you have to look past the blood on the floor and focus on a single piece of paper. It was a revised last will and testament, sitting on Arthur's desk, waiting for his signature at sunrise. Everyone trapped in the manor that night had a desperate reason to want Arthur dead before morning. But only one possessed the cold calculation to pull off an impossible murder. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from Weed. Love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The puzzle of Brampton Manor remains one of the most brilliant displays of deception in modern history, where every obvious clue was a carefully planted line meant to misdirect the authorities and protect a devastating family secret. Arthur Harrington was a man who built his massive fortune on ruthlessness, a trait he applied to his business empire and his own family with equal severity. He did not just demand respect from his relatives. He demanded absolute, unquestioning submission, using his vast wealth as a weapon to control their every waking move. Those who displeased him found themselves suddenly cut off, drowning in debt, or socially exiled without a second thought. His estate was a sprawling monument to his ego, standing miles away from the nearest town, heavily gated and heavily guarded. To the outside world, he was a respected philanthropist and a pillar of the community, but inside the heavy velvet curtains of his home, he was a psychological tyrant. He took pleasure in watching his dependents beg for their allowances, turning family dinners into cruel exercises in humiliation and emotional endurance. No one understood Arthur's cruelty better than his wife, Eleanor. For 30 years, she had endured his public affairs, his sharp insults, and his financial abuse with a quiet, stoic grace that many mistook for weakness. Eleanor was a woman who had long ago traded her own happiness for the security of her social standing, burying her resentment deep beneath perfect manners and a pristine wardrobe. She never raised her voice, she never argued back, and she maintained the illusion of a perfectly happy marriage for the sake of the press and polite society. But 30 years of constant belittlement takes a heavy toll on the human mind, slowly wearing away at a person's sanity until only a fragile shell remains. Friends of the family often wondered how much more she could take before the dam finally broke and the quiet, suffering widow decided she had enough. Then there was Julian, Arthur's charismatic but dangerously reckless nephew, who stood to inherit the bulk of the estate under the current will. Julian lived a life of extreme luxury, funding his expensive tastes and massive gambling debts entirely through his uncle's reluctant generosity. But Arthur had recently grown tired of bailing Julian out of trouble, discovering that the young man owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to very dangerous creditors. If Julian's inheritance was suddenly revoked, he would not just be penniless. He would likely be facing severe physical harm or prison time. Julian was desperate, pacing the halls of the manor like a caged animal, knowing that his entire future depended on keeping his uncle happy just a little bit longer. He had the physical strength to commit a violent act, and the immediate, terrifying financial motive to stop a new will from being signed. Adding to the tension was the presence of Dr. Vance, the family physician who had taken up permanent residence in the manor to monitor Arthur's failing heart. Dr. Vance was a respected medical professional on the surface, but he harbored a career-destroying secret that Arthur had recently uncovered. The doctor was facing a massive, hidden malpractice lawsuit, and Arthur was actively blackmailing him, forcing him to provide unethical medical treatments in exchange for his absolute silence. Dr. Vance had access to every drug in the house, a detailed knowledge of human anatomy, and a burning hatred for the man who was holding his medical license hostage. On the afternoon of the storm, Jane Marple had quietly observed the doctor aggressively rummaging through Arthur's private cabinet, his hands shaking violently. He was a man pushed to the absolute brink, terrified that Arthur would ruin his life on a mere whim. The final piece of the puzzle was Clara, a young, nervous maid who had only been working at the estate for a few short months. Clara kept her head down and rarely spoke, but she wore a heavy silver locket around her neck that she guarded with fierce, almost aggressive paranoia. Just one day before the murder, Clara and Arthur had been caught in a vicious, screaming argument in the drawing room, an event completely unheard of for a servant. Arthur had threatened to throw her out into the street, while Clara had yelled something indistinguishable before running away in tears, clutching her silver locket. Jane Marple noticed that Clara's eyes were entirely devoid of fear. Instead, they were burning with a cold, calculated anger that seemed vastly out of place for a simple maid. Everyone in the house was hiding something, and the storm outside was getting worse. The evening of the murder began with a suffocating tension as the torrential rain battered the stone walls of the isolated estate, cutting off the phone lines. At exactly 8 o'clock, the dinner bell rang, summoning the family and the doctor to a meal that would be entirely defined by suffocating silence and nervous glances. Arthur sat at the head of the table, smiling a cruel, triumphant smile as he looked at the terrified faces of the people who depended on his money. Midway through the main course, he tapped his crystal glass and joyfully announced that his lawyer would be arriving at dawn to execute a completely new will. He made it very clear that certain individuals at the table were going to be left with absolutely nothing, ensuring they would spend the rest of their lives in poverty. The blood drained from Julian's face. Eleanor stared blankly at her plate, and Dr. Vance gripped his surgical knife so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. By 10 o'clock, the storm had escalated into a raging tempest, and Arthur abruptly excused himself from the drawing room, locking himself inside his heavy oak-paneled study. He loudly declared that he was not to be disturbed by anyone until morning, turning the heavy brass key from the inside and sliding the deadbolt into place. The remaining guests dispersed to their respective rooms, creating a complex web of unverified alibis as the grandfather clock slowly ticked toward midnight. Jane Marple sat quietly in the corner of the library, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she carefully mentally tracked the footsteps echoing through the dark hallways. She noted exactly when Julian went upstairs, when Dr. Vance excused himself to the kitchen, and when Eleanor claimed she was retiring to her bedroom for the night. The manor fell into an uneasy, breathless silence, broken only by the violent thunder shaking the foundation. At exactly 15 minutes past 11, a massive lightning strike hit the property's main generator, plunging the massive house into absolute, blinding darkness. Panic immediately erupted in the upstairs corridors, with voices shouting in the pitch black and the sound of rushed, heavy footsteps running down the main wooden staircase. Julian and Dr. Vance bumped into each other in the dark hallway, desperately calling out for the maid to bring candles and flashlights from the basement storage. In the midst of the chaotic shouting, a loud, heavy thud echoed from the ground floor, followed instantly by the horrifying sound of shattering glass coming from Arthur's study. The men rushed downstairs, guided only by the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the windows, shouting Arthur's name and pounding desperately on the thick oak door. There was no answer from inside the study, only the deafening roar of the rain pounding against the glass. Realizing something was terribly wrong, Julian and Dr. Vance threw their entire body weight against the heavy wooden door, attempting to break the heavy brass deadbolt. It took 3 violent attempts before the wood finally splintered and the door gave way, sending both men stumbling forward into the pitch-black room. As the backup emergency lights slowly flickered on, illuminating the study in a dim yellow glow, the horrifying reality of the situation finally revealed itself to the gathered crowd. Arthur Harrington was lying flat on his back in the center of the Persian rug, his lifeless eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, the silver letter opener buried in his chest. The windows were completely locked from the inside. The chimney was far too narrow for a person to climb, and there was absolutely no one else hiding in the room.
The men stood frozen in absolute terror, staring at the locked windows and the broken door, completely unable to comprehend how the killer could have possibly escaped. If the door was locked from the inside and the windows were bolted shut, the murderer should logically still be standing right there in the room with them. Julian immediately began pacing frantically, accusing the doctor of foul play, while Eleanor stood in the doorway, staring at her dead husband with an expression completely devoid of emotion. Jane Marple did not look at the body at all. Instead, she walked quietly over to the fireplace and gently placed her hand near the burned logs. The ashes were completely ice cold, proving that the fire had been deliberately put out hours ago, completely contradicting Arthur's well-known habit of keeping a roaring fire until midnight. When the storm finally broke at dawn, the local authorities arrived, led by Inspector Craddock, a man who preferred quick arrests over complex logical deductions. Craddock took one look at the locked room, the staggering gambling debts, and the broken door, and immediately placed Julian in handcuffs, declaring the case closed. He argued that Julian had managed to lock the door from the outside using a complex string trick he had learned from a magic book in the library. But Jane Marple quietly pulled the inspector aside, pointing out tiny, impossible details that his aggressive investigation had completely managed to overlook in his rush for a conviction. She asked why Eleanor's favorite knitting needle was missing from her basket, and why Clara the maid had soaking wet shoes when she supposedly never left the kitchen. The entire complexion of the investigation changed drastically when the county coroner returned the official autopsy results late the following afternoon, revealing a shocking medical anomaly. Arthur Harrington did not die immediately from the stab wound to the chest. In fact, the blade had missed his main artery by a fraction of an inch. The toxicology report showed massive amounts of a rare, powerful muscle relaxant in his bloodstream, a drug exclusively found in Dr. Vance's private medical bag. Arthur had been completely paralyzed and rendered unconscious long before the blade ever pierced his chest, completely changing the timeline of the brutal murder. Someone had drugged his evening wine at dinner, waited for him to collapse in his locked study, and then executed the stabbing at a much later, more convenient time. With this new medical evidence, the suspicion immediately shifted violently away from Julian and squarely onto the terrified shoulders of Dr. Vance. The inspector raided the doctor's quarters, finding the empty vial of the muscle relaxant hidden poorly beneath a stack of medical journals in his bedside table. Vance swore up and down that the drug had been stolen from his bag earlier in the afternoon, but his hidden malpractice lawsuit provided an overwhelming motive for murder. The authorities were once again completely convinced they had their man, preparing to draft a formal murder charge against the disgraced physician by the end of the day. But Jane Marple remained sitting in her armchair, shaking her head slowly, knowing that framing the doctor was just another layer of deception designed to protect the true mastermind. Gathering the family in the drawing room, Jane Marple finally dismantled the illusion of the impossible locked room, exposing the absolute brilliance of the killer's plan. Arthur had indeed locked himself in the room from the inside, but the heavy dose of muscle relaxant had caused him to collapse unconscious on the rug before midnight. When the power went out and the men rushed downstairs to break down the door, Arthur was still very much alive, merely paralyzed and lying helpless in the dark. The killer did not escape the room before the door was broken. The killer was actually standing right there. The room fell into a stunned, breathless silence as the absolute genius and horrifying simplicity of the psychological trick finally washed over the gathered suspects. Jane Marple turned her sharp, calculating gaze away from the men and looked directly at the quiet, unassuming widow who had spent 30 years suffering in absolute silence. It was Eleanor who had slipped the muscle relaxant into Arthur's wine at dinner, knowing exactly how long it would take for the powerful drug to paralyze him. She had intentionally caused the power outage by tampering with the generator, using the ensuing panic and blinding darkness as the perfect cover to step into the room and finish the job. Eleanor did not deny a single word of the accusation. She simply folded her hands in her lap, lifted her chin, and calmly confessed to the murder of her tyrannical husband. The inspector immediately assumed that Eleanor had committed the crime to secure her massive inheritance before the new will could be signed the following morning. It made perfect, logical sense to the police. A beaten-down wife finally taking brutal control of her financial destiny by eliminating her abuser in cold blood. Eleanor was quietly handcuffed and led out of the manor, her face completely unreadable as she stepped into the back of the waiting police cruiser in the pouring rain. The local newspapers celebrated the quick resolution of the case, praising Inspector Craddock for his brilliant detective work in bringing a calculating, cold-hearted murderess to swift justice. But as Jane Marple watched the police car drive away down the long gravel driveway, she felt a deep, unsettling ache in her chest, knowing the story was far from over. A week later, Jane Marple traveled to the county prison to visit Eleanor, sitting across from the disgraced widow in a cold, concrete visitation room. Jane leaned forward and gently explained that she knew Eleanor was lying about delivering the fatal blow, because Eleanor had a severe medical condition that made it impossible to grip a weapon. Eleanor had indeed drugged the wine and tampered with the generator, intending to kill her husband, but someone else had beaten her to the final, fatal act in the dark. Jane revealed that she had noticed a tiny drop of blood on the heavy silver locket worn by Clara, the young, nervous maid who had argued with Arthur. Clara was not just a random servant. She was Arthur's secret, illegitimate daughter, a child he had abandoned to poverty decades ago, returning to claim her rightful vengeance. Eleanor finally broke her stoic silence, tears streaming down her face as she confessed the absolute, heartbreaking truth of what really happened in the darkness that night. She had watched Clara step forward in the pitch black and drive the blade into Arthur's chest, taking back the life that the cruel patriarch had stolen from her mother. In that split second, Eleanor made a choice to protect the young girl, quickly manipulating the crime scene and stepping forward to take the blame for the murder. Eleanor was willing to spend the rest of her life in a cold prison cell, sacrificing her own freedom so that Clara could finally have a chance at a normal life. Jane Marple sat in heavy silence, realizing that the greatest mystery of Brampton Manor was not how a man died, but why an innocent woman chose to throw her life away. For the first time in her long life of solving complex crimes, Jane Marple was faced with an impossible moral dilemma that completely challenged her belief in absolute justice. She held the evidence that could free Eleanor and send Clara to the gallows, a truth that would satisfy the law but completely destroy a young, traumatized girl's fragile future. Jane stood up, gently touched Eleanor's hand through the metal grating, and promised that she would never speak a single word of the truth to the police or the press. She walked out of the prison and threw her notebook out Toto the roaring river, choosing to let a guilty man remain dead and an innocent woman serve his penance. Sometimes, the most profound justice is not found in a courtroom, but in the quiet, unspoken sacrifices women make to protect the vulnerable from the cruelty of powerful men. Before you go, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think Jane Marple made the right decision? Should she have revealed the truth and allowed Clara to face justice? Or was protecting a young woman from a lifetime of suffering the greater act of justice? Let us know your answer in the comments below. If you enjoyed this mystery and love stories filled with secrets, twists, and unforgettable endings, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more captivating mysteries to life. And remember, not every mystery ends with an arrest. Not every truth belongs in a courtroom. And sometimes, the hardest cases leave behind questions that can never truly be answered. Until our next mystery, stay curious.